The worst part wasn't getting arrested, it was seeing my wife standing there like she had been waiting for it. The knock came at exactly 7:12 in the morning, sharp and deliberate, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. I was halfway through my coffee, still in my work shirt, thinking about a normal Tuesday, when the second knock hit harder, followed by a voice that cut straight through the door. Police. Open up. My first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. I hadn't done anything that would bring cops to my house, not even close. I walked to the door slowly, like maybe moving too fast would somehow make this real, and when I opened it, there were two officers standing on my porch, hands resting near their belts, eyes already locked on me like they knew exactly who I was. One of them asked my name. I nodded. He didn't hesitate. Ethan Cole, you're under arrest. For a second, I actually thought this had to be some kind of mistake, like they had the wrong address, the wrong person, something. For what? I asked, and even to me, my voice sounded distant, like it didn't belong in my own body. Fraud and embezzlement, the other officer said, already reaching for my wrist. The words didn't even register properly. Fraud? Embezzlement? I worked a steady job, paid my bills, lived a quiet life. There was nothing in my world that even touched that kind of accusation. And then I heard something behind me. Soft footsteps. Calm. I turned my head just enough to see her. Renee. My wife. She was standing in the hallway, arms folded, watching everything unfold like she had already seen this moment play out in her head 100 times. No panic. No confusion. Just stillness. That's when something inside me shifted. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder. Renee. I said, because I needed her to say something, anything, to make sense of what was happening. She didn't step forward. Didn't rush to my side. Didn't even look surprised. One of the officers gently but firmly guided my hands behind my back, securing the cuffs with a click that echoed louder than it should have. The metal was cold, but not as cold as the look on her face. You have the right to remain silent. The officer began, but I barely heard the rest. My focus stayed on her. The woman I had built a life with. The woman who knew every part of my routine, every account, every decision. The woman who, at that moment, looked like she had already moved on from all of it. As they led me out onto the front steps, I noticed the neighbors. Of course they were there. Curtains slightly pulled back, front doors cracked open just enough to watch without being seen. A couple standing across the street, pretending to check their mail while staring directly at me. I had lived on this block for years. Never caused a problem. Never gave anyone a reason to look twice. And now I was being walked out in handcuffs like I was something they had always suspected. The morning air felt different, heavier, like the entire street had shifted against me. I tried to replay everything in my head, searching for anything that could explain this, but there was nothing. No warning. No mistake I could point to. Just this sudden, complete collapse of everything I thought I understood. They opened the back door of the patrol car, and right before I got in, I looked back one more time. Renee was standing in the doorway now, framed by the house we shared, watching me leave. For a split second, I thought I saw something in her expression. Not regret. Not guilt. Something closer to relief. That was the moment I stopped thinking this was a mistake. Because people don't look relieved when something goes wrong. They look relieved when something goes exactly according to plan. And as the door shut behind me and the car started moving, one thought kept repeating in my head, louder than anything else. This didn't just happen to me. Someone made it happen. And deep down, before I had any proof, before I understood any of it, I already knew who that someone was. I used to believe that trust was something you built slowly, like a house you added to piece by piece, day after day, until it felt permanent, until it felt unbreakable, and that was exactly what I thought I had with Renee. Before that morning, before the flashing lights and the cold metal cuffs, my life had been predictable in the best way possible. I woke up at 6 every day, made coffee the same way, checked my emails before heading into work, and came home to a place that felt steady. Renee and I were not perfect, but we were stable, and in my mind, stability meant safety. I worked in financial operations for a mid-sized logistics firm, nothing flashy, nothing risky, just numbers, reports, and long hours that paid the bills and kept everything moving forward. I was careful with money, careful with decisions, careful with everything that could affect our future. Renee used to say that was what she loved about me, that I was reliable, that I made her feel secure. And I believed her, because she said it often enough that it started to sound like truth. Looking back now, I realize something I did not see then. The way she said those things was always a little too polished, a little too rehearsed, like she was saying what someone in her position was supposed to say, not what she actually felt. At the time, I ignored that feeling because everything else seemed fine. We had dinners together, talked about plans, even joked about taking a vacation once things at work slowed down. There were no obvious fights, no dramatic arguments, nothing that would make you think the person sitting across from you was quietly pulling your life apart behind the scenes. But there were small things, details that did not quite fit, things I brushed off because they did not seem important enough to question. She started taking more phone calls in another room, always saying it was work, always keeping her voice low enough that I could not hear the other side. There were nights she stayed out later than usual, explaining it away with meetings or last-minute obligations that sounded reasonable if you did not look too closely. And I did not look too closely, because I trusted her. That was my first mistake. I remember one evening in particular, about 3 weeks before everything collapsed. We were sitting in the living room, television on but neither of us really watching, and she was scrolling through something on her phone with a focus that felt different. Not casual, not relaxed, more like she was waiting for something. I asked her what she was looking at, and she smiled, just a quick, controlled expression, and said it was nothing important. Then she changed the subject immediately, asking me about a report I had mentioned earlier that day. At the time, it felt normal. Now it feels like a moment I should have stopped and paid attention to. There were also changes in how she talked about money. Subtle at first, almost like curiosity, asking more questions about my accounts, my access at work, how transactions were approved, who reviewed them. I answered everything without hesitation, because why would I not? She was my wife. There was no line in my mind between what was mine and what she was allowed to know. I thought transparency was part of being honest. I did not realize I was handing her pieces of something she was already building. Even the night before I was arrested, nothing felt urgent. We had dinner, talked about small things, and she went to bed earlier than usual, saying she had a long day ahead. I stayed up a little later, finishing some work emails, then turned off the lights and joined her. She was already asleep, or at least she looked like she was. Calm. Unbothered. Like someone who did not have a single concern in the world. That image stayed in my head during the ride in the patrol car, repeating itself over and over, because it did not match what was happening to me now. People do not go from a normal night to being accused of something this serious without something leading up to it. There had to be a sequence, a pattern, a setup that I had missed. And as I sat there, hands restrained, watching the streets pass by through the window, I started to understand something I should have seen much earlier. None of this felt random. None of it felt like a mistake. It felt structured. Planned. Like every quiet conversation, every question she asked, every moment I chose to trust instead of question, had been part of something much bigger than I allowed myself to imagine. And the more I thought about it, the more one realization kept pushing to the surface, something I was not ready to fully accept yet, but could not ignore anymore. This was not just about me being accused. This was about someone making sure I had no way to defend myself when it happened. By the time we reached the station, the reality of the situation had started to settle in, not all at once, but in layers, each one heavier than the last, and the first thing I realized was that nobody there was treating this like a misunderstanding. The officers were calm, procedural, efficient, like they had done this 100 times before, and to them, I was not someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. They led me through a series of steps that felt mechanical, almost detached from the life I had been living just hours earlier, taking my belongings, documenting everything, asking questions that sounded less like curiosity and more like confirmation. When they finally sat me down in a small room with a table and 2 chairs, I expected someone to come in and explain what was happening, to clear up the confusion, to tell me there had been a mistake. Instead, a detective walked in with a folder already in his hands, thick enough to suggest this had been building for a while. He introduced himself briefly, then opened the folder without hesitation, sliding a set of documents across the table toward me. "We have records of multiple unauthorized transfers linked to your credentials," he said, his voice steady, controlled, like he was reading from something he had already memorized. I looked down at the pages, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, numbers, dates, account references, all arranged in a way that pointed directly at me. Transactions I did not recognize, amounts that were far beyond anything I had access to, patterns that looked intentional, deliberate. It was not random. It was precise. Too precise. "This is not possible," I said, and for the first time, I could hear something in my voice that had not been there before, something closer to disbelief than confusion. The detective did not react. He simply turned another page. "These transactions were executed using your login credentials from your workstation," he continued, tapping a specific section of the document. "Access logs confirm it." That was when the second layer hit. My credentials. My workstation. My access. Everything tied directly back to me in a way that was difficult to argue against without proof I did not have. I tried to think, to retrace every day, every login, every action I had taken at work, but nothing matched what I was seeing in front of me. There were no gaps in my memory, no missing hours, no moments where I had done something like this and forgotten. It did not fit. None of it fit. "You can explain your side," he said, finally looking up at me, giving me a moment that felt less like an opportunity and more like a test. I opened my mouth, ready to say something, anything that could make this make sense, but the words did not come. Because how do you explain something you do not understand yourself? How do you defend against evidence that looks complete, structured, and already accepted as truth? That was when he said something that shifted everything again. "Your wife already provided a statement." For a second, I thought I had misheard him. "What?" I asked, the word coming out slower than I intended. He flipped to another section of the file and turned it slightly so I could see. A typed statement. Her name at the bottom. Renee Cole. My eyes moved across the lines, reading words that felt detached from the person I thought I knew. She described noticing unusual behavior, inconsistencies in my work habits, concerns about financial discrepancies I had dismissed when she asked. She positioned herself as someone who had been worried, someone who had tried to understand, someone who eventually felt she had no choice but to report what she believed was happening. It was detailed. Organized. Convincing. And the worst part was how calm it sounded. There was no anger in her words, no emotion, just a careful presentation of facts that pointed directly at me. I leaned back in the chair, the air in the room suddenly feeling heavier, harder to breathe. This was not just an accusation anymore. This was a narrative. A complete story built around me, supported by data, reinforced by someone who knew exactly how to make it believable. And sitting there, staring at those pages, I understood something that changed. The way I saw everything that had happened up to this point. This was never going to be a simple misunderstanding. Because misunderstandings do not come with this level of preparation. And people do not create stories like this unless they are certain no one will be able to tear them apart. The first time I stood in a courtroom, I realized something nobody ever tells you: it is not just about evidence, it is about perception, and once people decide what you are, everything else starts to align around that idea whether it is true or not. The room was colder than I expected, not physically, but in the way every glance seemed to carry a quiet judgment that had already been made before I even sat down. I could feel it in the way people avoided looking at me for too long, like they did not want to get too close to whatever they believed I had done. My lawyer sat beside me, flipping through documents with a kind of urgency that felt forced, like he was trying to catch up to something that had already moved too far ahead. Across the room, the prosecution looked calm, prepared, almost relaxed. That was the first sign that this was not going to go the way I thought it would. When the proceedings started, everything moved quickly, too quickly for me to fully process. Numbers were presented, timelines were explained, and each piece of information seemed to fit together in a way that made the story sound complete, clean, and undeniable. Every transaction they showed traced back to my credentials. Every log pointed to my access. Every detail reinforced the same conclusion. And then they called her. Renee walked to the stand with the same composure I had seen that morning, controlled, steady, like she had rehearsed every step. She took her seat, answered questions clearly, never hesitating, never contradicting herself. She spoke about noticing changes in my behavior, about concerns she had tried to ignore at first, about the moment she realized something was wrong and felt she had a responsibility to report it. The way she told it, she sounded reasonable, almost sympathetic, like someone who had been put in an impossible position and chose to do the right thing. I watched her. From where I sat, trying to find something, anything in her expression that felt familiar, something that connected to the person I thought I knew. There was nothing. No hesitation. No doubt. Just confidence. That was when I understood how deep this went. This was not just about the evidence. This was about control. She had shaped the narrative before I even knew there was one to defend against. When it was my turn to speak, everything felt different. My words sounded smaller, weaker, like they were competing against something that had already been accepted as truth. I explained that I did not make those transactions, that I had no reason to, that something was wrong with the records they were presenting. But without proof, without something concrete to counter what they had, it sounded like exactly what they expected it to sound like. A denial. Nothing more. The judge listened, expression neutral, but even in that neutrality, I could feel the weight of everything that had been presented before I spoke. By the time the hearing ended, I already knew where this was going. It was not a sudden realization. It was a slow, heavy understanding that settled in piece by piece as the day unfolded. When the decision came, it felt less like a shock and more like the final step in something that had been set in motion long before I walked into that room. The words were formal, controlled, delivered without emotion, but they carried a finality that was impossible to ignore. Convicted. The sound of it did not echo in the room. It echoed in me. And as everything around me moved forward, people standing, papers being gathered, voices shifting to the next case, I sat there for a moment longer than I should have, trying to understand how my life had been reduced to a version of events I knew was not real, yet had been accepted by everyone who mattered. Because the hardest part was not losing the case. It was realizing that the person who stood up there and made it possible had once been the person I trusted more than anyone else, and now she had become the reason I had nothing left to stand on. Time moves differently when everything has been taken from you, not in dramatic bursts, but in slow, repetitive cycles that make each day feel almost identical to the last, and at some point, you stop counting because the numbers do not change anything. The first few days were the hardest, not because of the place itself, but because my mind kept trying to reject what had happened, like it was waiting for someone to walk in and say there had been a mistake, that I could go home, that none of this was real. But no one came. No explanation. No correction. Just routine. Wake up. Follow instructions. Stay quiet. I learned quickly that speaking too much did not help. Explaining did not help. In a place like that, everyone has a version of events they believe in, and the system has already decided which version matters. So I stopped trying to convince people. I stopped trying to defend myself out loud. Instead, I started listening. Observing. Paying attention to details the same way I used to at work, when numbers did not quite match and you had to figure out why. Because the more I thought about everything that had happened, the less it felt like something chaotic and the more it felt like something structured. Too many pieces had fallen into place too perfectly. Too many variables had aligned in a way that made it easy to build a case against me and almost impossible for me to break it apart. That was not luck. That was design. The hardest part was the isolation, not physical, but mental. Being surrounded by people yet completely disconnected from anyone who knew who you were before all of this. Nights were the worst. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every moment with Renee, searching for the point where everything shifted. At first, all I saw was confusion. Then, slowly, patterns started to emerge. The questions she asked about my work, the way she seemed more interested in access than outcomes, the timing of her late nights, the calls she would not take in front of me. None of it had felt significant on its own. But together, it formed something else. Something intentional. There was one memory that kept coming back stronger than the others. A conversation about system access at my job, something I had explained. Casually, thinking it was harmless, describing how approvals worked, how credentials were verified, how certain transactions required layered authorization. At the time, it was just a normal conversation between two people who trusted each other. Now it felt like I had handed over a blueprint without realizing what it would be used for. That realization did not come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. This was not just about someone using my credentials. This was about someone understanding exactly how to make it look like I had done something I did not do. And there was only one person who had both the access to that information and the reason to use it against me. Even then, I did not let myself fully accept it. Not yet. Because accepting it meant acknowledging something deeper, something harder to face than the charges themselves. It meant admitting that the person I trusted most had not just turned against me, but had done it with patience, planning, and precision. And that kind of realization does not hit like a single moment. It settles in slowly, until one day you realize you are no longer asking if it is true. You are asking how far it goes. And that was the question that stayed with me, the one that refused to go away no matter how much time passed. Not whether she was involved. But how much of this had been her idea from the very beginning. Clarity does not arrive as a sudden breakthrough, it builds quietly, detail by detail, until the version of reality you were holding onto can no longer survive what you are starting to see, and for me, that shift began with something small, something almost forgettable if I had not been paying attention. It happened during a routine review session when an older inmate, someone who had spent years studying financial cases, made an offhand comment about how most embezzlement schemes fail because people overlook timing. He said that the numbers can be manipulated, access can be faked, but timing always leaves a trace if you know where to look. That idea stayed with me long after the conversation ended, not because I fully understood it at the time, but because it connected to something I had felt since the beginning. Something about my case had always felt too clean, too perfectly arranged, like every piece had been placed exactly where it needed to be. So I started rebuilding the timeline in my head, not from the perspective of what they said I did, but from the perspective of what I actually lived through. I went back to specific days, specific hours, recalling when I logged into my workstation, when I stepped away, when I attended meetings, when I left the office. I had always been consistent with my schedule, almost predictable, and that predictability, which I once saw as a strength, now looked like something that could be used against me. The more I reconstructed those moments, the more I noticed something that had not stood out before. There were transactions recorded at times when I was physically present somewhere else, not just generally busy, but visibly engaged in activities that others could confirm. Staff meetings. Lunch breaks in shared spaces. Moments where I was not alone, where I could not have been executing the actions they claimed. At first, I questioned my own memory. wondering if stress had altered how I recalled things, but the consistency of those recollections made that unlikely. Then I thought about access, about how my credentials were used, about how someone could replicate not just my login, but my behavior. That was when another detail surfaced, one I had overlooked completely. A few weeks before everything happened, Renee had asked me about remote access protocols, specifically how secure the system was when accessed from outside the office. At the time, I answered casually, explaining that while the system required verification, there were still ways authorized users could log in from different locations if they had the right credentials. I even mentioned how some employees occasionally accessed reports from home using secure connections. It had felt like a harmless conversation. Now it felt like a critical piece of something much larger. Because if someone understood how remote access worked, if they had the credentials, and if they knew my routine well enough to predict when I would be visible and when I would not, they could create a pattern that looked like me without ever being in the same place. That realization did not prove anything on its own, but it shifted the entire structure of the case in my mind. It introduced the possibility that what looked like direct evidence was actually constructed, layered carefully to eliminate doubt. And once that idea took hold, more pieces started to fall into place. The timing of her questions. The changes in her behavior. The way she had already formed a narrative before I even knew there was one. It was not random curiosity. It was preparation. I started to see the connections not as isolated moments, but as parts of a sequence that had been building over time. Each conversation, each detail I had shared, each assumption I had made about trust had contributed to something I never saw coming. And the more complete that picture became, the harder it was to ignore the conclusion forming at the center of it. This was not just a case built against me. It was a case built using me. My habits. My access. My trust. Everything I believed made my life stable had been turned into the foundation of something designed to take it apart. And for the first time since everything began, I was not just reacting to what had happened. I was starting to understand how it happened, and more importantly, who had the ability to make it happen in the first place. The day they told me I was being released did not feel like freedom, it felt like a pause, like something unfinished had been pushed forward without being resolved, and the moment I stepped outside, I understood that nothing was waiting for me the way it used to. The air felt the same, the streets looked the same, but the way people looked at me had changed, like something invisible had been attached to my name and followed me wherever I went. I did not go home right away. Not because I could not, but because I knew it would not be the same place I left behind. Instead, I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of everything that had happened sit where it needed to sit. Most people expect anger at a moment like that, or relief, or even confusion, but what I felt was something else entirely. Focus. Because by then, I was no longer trying to figure out if I had been set up. I was trying to understand how to prove it. I had spent enough time rebuilding the timeline in my head to know that the truth was not random, it was hidden in patterns, in details that had been overlooked because the larger story felt convincing enough on its own. The system had accepted a version of events that was built to look complete, but completeness does not always mean accuracy. It just means no one has looked closely enough yet. That was what I was going to change. The first place I went was not my house, it was a public library about 2 miles away, a place where I could sit without questions, where I could access what I needed without drawing attention. Old habits returned quickly. I pulled records, reviewed access protocols, revisited everything I knew about how the system tracked logins, how timestamps were generated, how remote sessions were recorded. I was not looking for something dramatic. I was looking for something small, something that did not align perfectly with the rest. Because perfect systems do not exist. There is always a flaw. There is always a detail that gets overlooked. It took time, longer than I expected, but eventually I found the first crack. It was subtle, almost insignificant if you were not specifically looking for it. A discrepancy between the recorded login location and the network routing path. The system showed that my credentials had been used from my workstation, but the underlying network data suggested the connection had originated from a different access point before being redirected. It was not something an average user would notice, and it was not something that would stand out unless you knew how to read it. But once I saw it, I could not ignore it. That was proof that the activity had been routed, not performed directly from where they claimed. It was not enough to clear me on its own, but it was enough to break the illusion of certainty the case had been built on. And once that illusion cracks, everything else becomes questionable. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen, letting that realization settle in. This was not just a theory anymore. This was a starting point. A way in. The more I thought about it, the more I understood what I needed to do next. This was never going to be about proving everything at once. It was about exposing one flaw at a time until the entire structure could no longer hold itself together. And there was one person who had built that structure, one person who had taken everything I trusted and turned it into something that nearly destroyed me. Renee had created a version of reality that everyone accepted without question. Now it was my turn to make them question it. Not with anger. Not with noise. But with something far more difficult to ignore. Proof. I did not rush back into the courtroom the moment I found that first inconsistency, because I understood something most people overlook when they are trying to prove the truth: timing matters just as much as evidence, and if you reveal something too early without the structure to support it, it gets dismissed before it has a chance to change anything. So I waited, not passively, but deliberately, building everything piece by piece until the version of events they believed in could not hold its shape anymore. The motion for review was filed quietly, supported by technical analysis that most people in the room would not fully understand at first glance, but that was the point: it forced them to look closer, to question details they had previously accepted without hesitation. When the day came, I walked back into that courtroom with the same calm I had learned to carry through everything that had happened, not because I was unaffected, but because I knew exactly what I was there to do. The room looked the same walls, the same arrangement, but the atmosphere felt different, not in a dramatic way, just a subtle shift, like something beneath the surface had started to move. Renee was there, seated in the same place she had been before, composed, controlled, but there was something new in the way she held herself, something slightly tighter, like she was aware that this was not just a continuation of what had already happened. When the proceedings began, the initial tone was skeptical, almost dismissive, as if this was just another attempt to delay what had already been decided. But that changed the moment the technical expert began explaining the routing discrepancy. It was not presented as an accusation. It was presented as a fact. A measurable, verifiable inconsistency between what the system reported and what actually occurred beneath the surface. The explanation was precise, layered in a way that made it difficult to ignore without directly addressing it. The more it was broken down, the clearer it became that the transactions could not have originated in the way they were originally claimed. That alone did not point to who was responsible, but it shattered the certainty that had been used to convict me. And once certainty is gone, everything else becomes unstable. I watched as the prosecution adjusted, trying to reframe the narrative, suggesting alternative explanations, but each one required assumptions that were weaker than what they had relied on before. The structure was starting to shift. Then came the part that changed everything. Additional records were introduced, access logs that had been overlooked, patterns that showed repeated attempts to access the system from an external device during times when I was visibly engaged elsewhere. It was not a single piece of evidence that did it. It was the accumulation. The pattern. The consistency of something that no longer pointed at me, but away from me. That was when attention turned, slowly at first, then more directly, toward the question that had not been asked before. If it was not me, then who had both the knowledge and the opportunity to create something this precise? I did not say her name. I did not need to. Because the moment they started connecting the timeline to the people who had access to my routines, to my information, to the details I had unknowingly shared, the focus shifted on its own. Renee's composure changed in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it, a slight pause, a hesitation that had not been there before. For the first time, the narrative she had built was no longer protecting her, it was exposing her. Questions that had once supported her position now required deeper answers, and those answers were not as clean as they had been the first time. The room was no longer looking at me the same way. The certainty was gone, replaced by something else, something far more powerful. Doubt. And in a system built on certainty, doubt is not just a crack, it is the beginning of everything falling apart. I did not need to react. I did not need to speak more than necessary. Because everything I needed to say was already there, laid out in a way that could not be ignored anymore. And as the realization spread through the room, quiet but undeniable, I understood something that had taken me far too long to accept. The truth does not need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be undeniable when the moment comes. The moment the final decision was delivered, it did not come with drama or raised voices, it came quietly, almost clinically, like a correction being made to something that should have never been accepted in the first place, and in that silence, everything that had been built against me finally collapsed under its own weight. The conviction was overturned, not because of emotion, not because of sympathy, but because the structure that supported it could no longer stand when examined closely. The evidence that once seemed complete was now recognized as incomplete, flawed in ways that could not be ignored, and once that happened, the rest followed naturally. I did not react the way people might expect in that moment. There was no visible relief, no sudden release of everything I had carried. Just a quiet acknowledgement that what needed to happen had happened. Around me, the room shifted in subtle ways. People who had once avoided looking at me now held their gaze a little longer, not out of connection, but out of reconsideration. The narrative had changed, and with it, so had their understanding of who I was. Renee did not say anything. She remained where she was, but the control she once carried was gone, replaced by something far less stable, something uncertain. The questions directed at her were no longer supportive, no longer guiding her toward a clear answer. They required explanations that did not come easily, that did not fit together the way they had before. And that was enough. Because once someone is forced to explain what was once assumed, the illusion starts to fade. I did not stay after that. There was nothing left in that room for me to prove, nothing left to reclaim in that space. I had already taken back the only thing that mattered, the truth. As I stepped outside, the air felt different again, but not because it had changed, because I had. The weight I carried was not gone, it had simply shifted, no longer pressing down on me in the same way, but existing as something I understood rather than something that controlled me. I did not go looking for her. I did not need closure from someone who had already shown me exactly who she was. Some people believe closure comes from confrontation, from final words, from forcing an ending that feels complete. I learned something different. Closure comes from clarity. From seeing everything for what it actually is, without the need to change it or fix it. The life I had before was built on assumptions, on trust that was never questioned, on a version of reality that felt stable because I chose to believe it was. That version is gone now. Not taken from me, but replaced by something more accurate. Something real. I started over, not in a dramatic way, not with some sudden transformation, but with small, deliberate steps, rebuilding everything with a different understanding of what matters and what does not. Work came back slowly. Reputation takes time to repair, even when the truth is clear, but I did not rush it. I had already learned what happens when you assume things will hold without being tested. As for Renee, I did not follow what happened next. I heard enough to understand that the same system that once worked in her favor no longer did, that the questions she could not answer did not simply disappear once I walked away. But that was not my concern anymore. I did not need to see the outcome to know that actions carry consequences, whether they arrive immediately or take time to surface. The only thing I carried forward from all of it was a simple understanding that changed everything about how I see the world. The people who appear calm in moments of chaos are not always the ones in control. Sometimes, they are the ones who believe their version of the truth will never be challenged. And when it finally is, they are not prepared for what comes next. I was. And that made all the difference. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.